The first victim didn't realize they were a victim. That was the most terrifying part. It began with a phone call, short, calm, and perfectly ordinary. The voice on the other end sounded polite, almost reassuring. The caller claimed to be part of a routine survey connected to a recent online purchase. Nothing felt urgent, nothing felt dangerous. The victim answered a few questions, then the call ended. 2 days later, the victim received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a printed photograph taken from across the street. It showed the victim standing near their front door, keys in hand. The timestamp was accurate. The angle was impossible to notice in real time. At the bottom of the photo was a single line of text: "You did exactly what I expected." Police would later learn this wasn't a threat, it was confirmation. Over the next 6 months, similar envelopes appeared in different cities across the United States. Different people, different lives, but the same pattern. Each person had recently interacted with something small: an online quiz, a feedback form, a casual phone call. None of them were harmed, at least not physically. Instead, each person was shown proof that someone knew their routines better than they did themselves. Where they parked when they slept, which routes they walked without thinking. The killer never touched them, never broke in, never followed them openly. Yet every detail was correct. The media didn't call it murder at first. There were no bodies, no crime scenes, just shaken people walking into police stations with envelopes in their hands and fear in their eyes. Then the first death happened. A man in Ohio collapsed during a work presentation. Cause of death, cardiac arrest, no foul play. But investigators later found an unopened envelope in his briefcase. Inside was a photo of him taken that same morning entering the building. The line at the bottom read, "You were never supposed to open this." That's when the FBI stepped in. Behavioral analysts noticed something disturbing. The victims weren't random. They were chosen because they reacted in predictable ways under psychological pressure. Fear, curiosity, obedience, guilt. The killer wasn't hunting bodies, he was testing minds. Every victim unknowingly became a witness, not to a crime scene, but to their own psychological limits. Some panicked, some froze, some tried to fight back. Their reactions were documented, analyzed, and compared. The envelopes kept coming. And somewhere out there, a killer was watching, not with a weapon, but with patience. Because the real experiment had only just begun. The police initially treated the first statement as a miracle. A victim who survived, clear memory, detailed description that almost never happened. But within weeks, something disturbing emerged. Another attack, different city, different victim. Yet the statement was almost identical. The same calm voice, the same instructions, the same phrase spoken at the end: remember everything. This second survivor had never met the first. Different background, different age, different routine. But when detectives compared their testimonies side by side, the language matched almost word for word. Not copied, conditioned. That was when the case stopped being about violence and started being about control. Behavioral analysts were called in. They noticed something chilling. The killer never rushed, never shouted, never threatened. Instead, he spoke slowly, calmly, guiding his victims through the experience as if it were a lesson. He explained what was happening, why it was happening, and most importantly, what they were supposed to remember afterward. Fear was not accidental, it was engineered. Each victim was released only after demonstrating perfect recall of events. Those who panicked were calmed. Those who cried were reassured. Those who dissociated were gently pulled back. The killer didn't want silence, he wanted testimony. As more survivors came forward, investigators uncovered a hidden pattern. Every victim had one thing in common. They had once served as witnesses in unrelated criminal cases. Minor ones, traffic incidents, domestic disputes, workplace harassment. They testified, they spoke. They went home, and years later they were chosen. This was not revenge, it was research. The killer was studying memory under extreme stress. How accurately could humans recall events? What details survived fear? Which ones broke? He wasn't running from law enforcement. He was building a data set and then a breakthrough. A forensic linguist noticed something unusual in the statements. Certain phrases weren't remembered, they were planted. Subtle repetition, rhythmic cadence, language designed to embed itself during trauma. The victims hadn't just survived the attacks, they had been programmed to remember them, which meant one terrifying possibility. The killer wanted to be found, and the witnesses were his message. The message left the investigation team frozen. If the people who survived were witnesses, then the people who didn't survive were never meant to speak at all. The FBI finally changed its approach. Instead of searching for a killer who enjoyed death, they began profiling someone who enjoyed control. Every survivor shared the same pattern. They were isolated. They were psychologically broken. They were forced to make a decision that affected someone else. One victim was made to choose which door to open. Another was forced to decide who would receive help first. A third had to give a name. Those choices haunted them more than the physical pain. The killer didn't want silence. He wanted confession. Agents realized something disturbing. The killer was recreating interrogation psychology, but outside the law. He wasn't asking questions. He was manufacturing guilt. Then a breakthrough came from an unexpected place. One survivor, who had never spoken publicly, contacted the task force. She said the killer didn't threaten her life. He threatened her identity. He told her exactly who she was, what she feared, what she would sacrifice to survive. And then he said something chilling. "You don't need me to ruin your life. You'll do it yourself." That line changed everything. Analysts compared the language used in survivor statements to academic material. They found near-exact matches in unpublished psychology papers written years earlier. The author, a former behavioral researcher dismissed from a federal ethics board. His work had focused on one idea: that people reveal their true selves only when forced to choose between moral collapse and survival. He believed courts failed because they punished actions, not decisions. He wanted witnesses, not victims, to carry the weight. Agents moved fast. The researcher lived quietly. No criminal record, no violent history. Inside his home, they found detailed files, not of deaths, but of people. Every survivor, every choice they made, every confession they would eventually give. He had never needed to be present at the crime scenes, because the crime was already complete the moment the choice was made. When arrested, he didn't resist. He only asked one question: did they tell you what they chose? That was the final confirmation. The killer didn't turn victims into witnesses by accident. He designed them that way. And in court, every survivor testified. Not against him, but against themselves. The jury didn't need a weapon. The truth was already spoken. The press called it a miracle. 3 victims were alive. All 3 had faced the same killer, and all 3 were now testifying against him. But inside the task force, no one was celebrating, because the killer hadn't made mistakes. He had allowed himself to be seen. The man's name was Elliot Kane. At least, that was the name connected to the abandoned warehouse where he was finally arrested. No resistance, no weapon, no attempt to flee. He sat calmly on a chair, hands folded, as if he had been waiting. During interrogation, Elliot spoke freely. Too freely. He didn't deny anything. He explained it. "I never wanted to kill them," he said. "I wanted them to remember." Investigators learned the truth piece by piece. Elliot was a behavioral analyst who had once worked as a consultant for criminal rehabilitation programs. His job was to interview violent offenders and determine whether they could be safely released. Over time, he became convinced of one thing: fear was the most honest form of testimony. So he designed his crimes as controlled experiments. He selected victims carefully. Not random people, but individuals who had once ignored crimes, stayed silent, or walked away from wrongdoing. People who had witnessed something and chosen not to act. He never touched them violently. Instead, he trapped them in situations where they believed death was inevitable. Rooms that locked automatically, buildings rigged with countdown sounds, messages timed to simulate pursuit. And then, he let them go. The trauma forced their memories open. They remembered details, faces, sounds, places. When investigators cross-checked those memories, something chilling emerged. Each victim had unknowingly provided crucial information about other unresolved cases: hit and runs, assaults, disappearances. Crimes that had gone cold because witnesses had stayed quiet. Elliot hadn't just created witnesses, he had reactivated them. The court case shattered legal precedent. His defense argued he had saved lives. The prosecution argued psychological torture was still torture. In the end, Elliot Kane was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. But the damage and the revelations couldn't be undone. Dozens of cold cases were reopened. 7 convictions followed. Families finally got answers. And a new term entered criminal psychology textbooks: witness activation trauma. Today, law enforcement uses his methods only in theory, never in practice. Because what Elliot proved terrified everyone. You don't need to kill someone to destroy their sense of safety. And you don't need to silence witnesses if you can turn them into living evidence. Some killers want bodies, some want silence, and some want the truth, no matter how much it costs. If you found this story disturbing, subscribe for more psychological crime stories. Thank you for watching.